This is a book review of Cain's Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. What is this book about? This book is about how, in her view, there is an extrovert ideal. There is a bias towards extroversion, which is promoted in school. She argues that schools are set up, organised and arranged for and by introverts, in that quiet students are often overlooked. Group work, class discussions, volunteering, presentations are often rewarded in school, and she says that this can be quite detrimental to the development of introverts, and that they can often grow up thinking that they're a little bit strange and they're not quite as good as extroverts. She talks about how this bias towards extroversion in modern society, with social media, advertising, television, came about due to urbanisation in the late 19th century as people migrated towards cities, and the emphasis on in much of the self-help literature transitioned from inner character, from integrity, from virtues such as patience, temperance, being quiet, being a good listener, towards more outwards presentation, display, talking ability, communication ability, and this took place because of the power of marketing and of the need in the big cities for companies to sell products and services, and so there was a huge demand for people that were good at selling. And similar to Stephen Covey, she criticises much of what Dale Carnegie promoted in his book, which is all about smiling, about being friendly, about being optimistic. She isn't particularly critical of extroversion. This book is not an attack on extroverts, although watching some of the book reviews on YouTube, it does seem as though extroverts enjoyed the book much less. She's of the view that society is unbalanced, that introverts have a rough deal because being quiet, being withdrawn, being thoughtful, not being the loud, domineering character isn't as rewarded. People of this nature can be overlooked for promotion in the workplace. But she argues that many people, including Bill Gates, for example, classic introverts, his quiet nature, he spent hours as a child learning to program on the computer that by chance happened to be in his high school. And if he were not so persistent and didn't enjoy working by himself independently for a long period of time, she argues the case that one of the big advantages of introverts is that they tend to focus on one particular concept, idea, activity for a longer period of time with greater depth. They can be more skeptical, more critical, and they think much more deeply about subjects. The classic quote from Einstein, who said, "It's not that I'm so smart, it's that I stick to questions for much longer." So it's not, that his IQ was crazy high, although he did have a very high IQ. It's that he persevered and continued to think about a particular question and didn't stop until he got to the very bottom of it. And she says that this is a particular characteristic of introverts, and that so many very successful creatives have an introverted nature. You know, J.K. Rowling, for example, is a classic introvert. That entire world of Hogwarts and Harry Potter, brilliant story, complex. You know, it's a whole universe really. That was all going on in her head, and she said that she actually got to the idea, or she realised the idea, on a train, I think from Manchester to London. But introverts have a lot going on, even though their outward appearance might be quite sort of plain, and to many extroverts it can seem quite boring, not very charismatic, not very energising, but often their ideas and their unique abilities to question and think through things thoroughly has very large advantages. She argues, for example, that the 2008 crash was partly a consequence of the fact that for many years extroverts who are possibly are more risky, are more inclined to take risks, were promoted in various companies, in banks, in financial companies, investment companies, pension providers, and so on. And that this, because from 1999, the dot-com bubble, to 2008, there was pretty much a bull run, things were going fine, and so the risky individuals within companies were promoted, and this led to more risky behaviour, and the fact that they seem to overlook what caused the 2008 financial crisis, which was that the subprime mortgages, which were very risky, maybe deeper thinkers, more thoughtful individuals who would have put that under the microscope and stopped to think about it for a much longer period of time, they might have been more critical and sceptical of financial companies who were investing in those kinds of assets with hidden or hard to see risk. And so that's the case she makes. Incidentally, she also says that Warren Buffett, who is very much an introvert, escaped and managed to avoid the irrationality of crowds and the madness of crowds, because he, in 2008, he wasn't particularly affected. In fact, he benefited because he had a lot of cash reserves. He was building cash reserves because he thought that the markets had gone too high, and he was able to take advantage a few years after, when stock prices had come down. He also said during the dot-com bubble that these prices are way too high. He wasn't getting carried away with the exuberance or jumping on the bandwagon. He was able to calmly, patiently, cautiously criticise much of the behaviour that he saw in relation to the internet stocks, which had, in his view, crazy valuations which weren't justified by the income that they were, in this case, not making. In many cases, many of those stocks that crashed during the dot-com bubble simply weren't making any money. And again, that paid dividends, that particular style, because he was able to think outside the box and step away from the crowd. There is quite a lot of science in this book. She doesn't just rely on anecdotal evidence to support her claims. She talks about neuroscience and suggests that introverts are more sensitive to stimuli. They're more responsive, they're more reactive to changes in the environment. She points towards a number of studies which, for example, looked at 4-year-olds' behaviour in response to stimuli such as popping of balloons, pictures of clowns, and introverts at this young age, they responded much more than the extroverts. So it's a little bit paradoxical, but because they're more responsive to the environment, as they get older, they detach somewhat. They shun the environment because it's overstimulating. It causes too much emotional reaction. So introverts can shy away from being in crowded places and busy places where there's a lot of noise and there's a lot going on because they have a brain which is more sensitive to the environment, so they prefer quieter spaces. Another suggestion is that the amygdala of introverts is more sensitive. So if there's a lot of noise, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unpredictability, this causes them greater anxiety, causes them greater stress because their amygdala, which is responsible for producing the fight or flight response and adrenaline and cortisol, this is much more sensitive in introverts. So this means that they don't want to be in environments that are going to produce that anxious feeling of stress. They get stress quite easily. It's why introverts, after around 2 hours at a party, want to go home. And they want to go home to recharge their batteries because they find being around people very tiring. Because if you have an amygdala which is firing on all cylinders, it's going to tire you out. Whereas extroverts are a little bit different. They're actually charged by talking with people and being in social environments. That's how they get their energy. It was actually Carl Jung who came up with the terms introversion and extroversion, and his definition was that introverts are energized by the world within, so they have a lot more going on in their heads and they can lose themselves, so they're energized by the world within themselves, in their subconscious. That's where they prefer to reside, whereas extroverts prefer the external world of people and things, so they prefer the environment, and they're energized by doing in the environment, by engaging with the external world. And so this is the difference between the two. Most behavioural psychologists agree that introversion and extroversion are characteristics which differentiate people, which is quite surprising because psychologists rarely agree on anything, but on so many different personality tests, introversion and extroversion always come up. There are plenty of personality tests which you can take which tells you if you are an introvert or extrovert, but one way to find out for yourself, and really I would say the biggest takeaway of this book is to really understand what you are. Because if you work in a busy environment, if you're in a workplace where there's a lot of talking, you're surrounded by people, you're more likely to find that absolutely exhausting at the end of the day, and you just want to go home and get into bed and maybe read or just watch a bit of light television, absolutely exhausted. And doing this for a long period of time can severely affect your health. If you're constantly getting absolutely knackered because you find it so tiring being in social environments. And you might think that there's something wrong with you. This is one of the points that Susan Cain made, that because there is a bias towards extroversion, introverts often feel like they need to be social, because otherwise they're seen as sort of unsocial, on the periphery of society. Oh, he's a little bit strange, he doesn't engage, he doesn't like talking to people. But it's quite important to figure out what you are. One question you can ask yourself is, how would I prefer to spend Friday night? Me personally, I prefer to spend time by myself or with a very small number of people, because I am quite introverted. I find it tiring being around a lot of people, particularly after a hard day at work. That's my ideal Friday evening, reading a book, quiet environment, nice and peaceful, can relax, can switch off, can sort of contemplate, think about things that happened during the week, and just let your imagination run wild, come up with some creative ideas. But this is completely alien to extroverts. After a hard day's week at work, they want to go to the club, and they want to go dancing at the nightclub, possibly they want to have a few drinks. Completely different to introverts. And she talks about how there was a couple, because many marriages take place between introverts and extroverts, and during the marriage there can be quite a lot of disagreements due to this particular difference, which can, in some cases, threaten to break the marriage apart. So she talks about stories of this kind, which you can read about in the book. She talks about differences between the East and the West. She talks about how in countries like China and Japan, for example, the culture isn't nearly as extroverted as the United States. There's much more of an emphasis on being quiet and listening to people, and it's seen as being slightly more discourteous to talk all of the time, because they kind of see it as sort of intruding upon someone's mental space. Like, to talk is to put a thought into someone's head, which doesn't necessarily need to be there. And so it shouldn't be assumed that talking is in and of itself a good thing, because people can talk a load of nonsense, people can talk a load of rubbish, people can put negative ideas in people's heads, even without realising it, even without intending to do so. So there's more of an idea in the Eastern countries that one should only speak if it improves upon the silence, as Gandhi famously said. And sometimes it can be a bit of a cultural shock for Chinese students who go to the United States, because in the American classrooms, talking, group work, discussing, debating, arguing, presenting is much more preferred. And so she talks about how there's an interesting clash almost between the two different philosophies, and she goes into that in quite some detail, which is quite interesting. But it's a great book. I don't fully agree with all of the points she makes, because I do think when it comes to personality, a lot depends on circumstance, in that we actually are not just one personality, we can be many different personalities depending on our role and the particular job at hand, what we're actually doing. A doctor goes to work and he becomes the doctor, Dr. Jones. But then at home with his wife and kids, he is father and wife, he has a different personality. And then maybe he goes into a different environment and he adjusts his personality. So possibly she doesn't quite talk about how versatile and adaptive personality is, and a lot depends on the environment and the circumstances we find ourselves in. But I do definitely agree with her main points, that there is a bias towards extroversion, and that being a quiet, thoughtful, cautious, critical, deep thinker clearly has huge advantages. So I agree with the main premise of her book, but there are some aspects which I think she's slightly overlooked and possibly doesn't give enough emphasis to. But it's a great book, it will definitely make you think. I would highly recommend it for introverts in particular, because I do feel as though many introverts are not aware that this book exists, and that there is nothing wrong with wanting to spend time by yourself, reading a book for many hours. Absolutely nothing wrong with that at all. It's your nature, it's your personality, and you shouldn't be made to feel like you're a sort of a recluse. Particularly with the advent of social media, being someone who is not on social media, you can feel like a leper, almost somebody who is completely outside the norm. But this book will just help you realise that you have a personality, and that's to be cherished and promoted and encouraged as much as possible, and you should be proud of your personality. So I'll leave this with you today, but great book by Suzanne Cain. You can watch a TED talk that she gave. I think it had something like 15 million views, and she's given a number of talks on YouTube which you can watch, highly insightful. She's a great writer. The style of her writing, the flow of the sentences, every sentence matters and is important. The use of language, her adjectives. It's a brilliantly written book, and she's an excellent speaker as well. Highly engaging, quite entertaining. Clearly has read a lot of books in her lifetime. She starts off that TED talk by saying how when she was a child, in her home, reading was the primary activity. The family home would be surrounded by books, and they would sit in the living room or in a room, and they would all be reading books for many hours. And she went to summer camp, and was made to feel bad because in the summer camp everything was about group activities and excitements and running around, and she was told that, you know, you're not allowed to get those books out, or she was discouraged from reading quietly to herself. So that's how she begins that TED talk. But she draws upon a wide body of literature, and the width of her research is really enjoyable to listen to, and you can definitely learn a lot from reading the book and also listening to her speeches. Thank you for watching.